Okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you join us from all around the world. And thank you for joining this month's Impact Talk. My name is Arzu Demirel, and I am the chair at Turkey Impact Council and founder at Headline Diversity. And today we talk about racial justice efforts, bias, and change through social impact lens. We have with us global leaders of our Impact 2030 network. So Jerome, Tennile, he's co-chair at Baltimore Council and social impact manager at Marriott International. And Chris Jarvis, he is the co-founder at Impact 2030 and Realize World. So thank you for joining us. And my first question is to Jerome. Jerome, can you just tell us, do you think that what corporate America did this year after George Floyd's killing was a good brand activism, or it was just a public relations effort?
Yeah, I think realistically, it was a little bit of both, right? I think there's a spectrum that exists. And I think on one hand of the spectrum, you have companies that are incredibly authentic and sincere. They've had a self-reckoning and they really want to do right, and they want to do right in every way possible. And then I also think that, again, that the realist inside of me says, well, I think some of them were less authentic, and for them, it was an opportunity to not necessarily live out any real core value, but it was an opportunity for them to maximize brand exposure around a press statement or around social media. And here's what I mean by all this. So I think there are a handful of companies, and when I say handful, I mean there are quite a few that are sincere. But then on the other hand, I think many companies are incredibly reactive. They react to their stakeholders, their investors, they react to their customers, they react to the general public, they react to politicians and what they see in the news headlines. And it makes me wonder how many of those companies were actually reacting in haste based on what they saw in a news headline or what they felt they had to do just to immediately get that check in a box to satisfy a customer. I saw recently in a Forbes piece that there was over 50 billion with a B that was actually pledged to Black community-based organizations. But when you really look at the data, only 250 million of that 50 billion was actually spent. So it makes me a little wary. And then I would say that the other part of that too is I think that the figures that you get in the data that determine who is pledged and who's actually fulfilled that commitment and everything that they're doing is going to be different based on who you ask. So when we're talking about corporations, especially here in America, that's only 1%. That's only 1% of the 28 million businesses that exist here in our country. The other 99% are small, mid-sized businesses. And I have to wonder, when I'm walking down Main Street in some of these small towns, when they have the Black Lives Matter banner in their window, I have to wonder internally, is it performative allyship? Is it virtue signaling? Or are they really doing something behind the scenes to meet that demand? So that's the long answer to say that I think it depends on what segment of business you ask. And then it also, I think, depends greatly on who's at which end of that spectrum. But I think it's a little bit of both.
And what is the current situation now? I mean, what is currently most needed for Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, I think right now people are starting to dig into the facts, right? They're starting to look at those numbers, the 50 billion pledged versus 250 million that was actually spent. And unfortunately, society isn't really patient. So I think there's a little bit of reality setting in for the general public, right? We're looking at these numbers and when we're highly skeptical, as I think we all should. We should all have a healthy bit of skepticism. as how are companies actually reacting to this, and have they fulfilled the commitments that they made a year ago. But I also just want to say that I also want to make a distinction between Black Lives Matter, the organization, and Black Lives Matter, the movement. The organization has existed since 2013, so almost 10 years now. And the actual movement led by the organization can be incredibly controversial. So when I talk about Black Lives Matter, I'm talking more so the movement. And I would say that even before BLM, the movement has existed, these are things that corporations have been working on for decades, right? And so when we're looking at public sentiment now, people are now looking at companies and they're asking for transparency. They want to make sure that what those companies pledged, what they made a commitment to last year, is that they're making progress towards it. Understanding that these are things that are not going to get fixed in a single year's time. But the movement is alive for sure. I would say that I did see some public statements yesterday. Not as many as we saw last year, which makes me pause a little bit. But of course, the movement, I would say, is alive and well. And although we don't see as much protesting as we did last year, there is a lot of racial tension that's pent up. It's certainly a powder keg.
Oh, okay. And Chris, and this year, yes, corporate giving for racial justice and equity was on the rise. And is it still booming? And how do you see the future about corporate giving for equity?
Yeah, a great question, Arzu. I'm going to appeal to a bit of research that was done to look at the difference between 2019 and 2020. So I don't have insight into what's happening in 2021. And as Jerome indicated, although the movement and the issue continues to grow and percolate and become a pressure point in the United States, and rightly so, I don't know if everybody's still engaging with it, or if people are kind of moving on to what's the next thing that we should be looking at. But the difference between 2019 and 2020, if you look at Benevity, and just for the folks who are on the call, and Aaron, I don't know, I know my firm, Realize Where It does work with eBay, but I don't know, I can't recall what platform you guys are using. But Benevity produces a technology platform to facilitate employee volunteering, employee giving, and grant making. And they're one of the largest in the space. They came from nothing in 2008, and now they're kind of the largest in the space. And they have about $1.1 billion in funding at the moment. And so they did a report on the companies using their platform. So these companies range in size from 1,000 or so to 500,000. Sodexo is 650,000 in France, for example. And out of those 650 companies, they were able to take what I think is probably a pretty accurate assessment of what's happening globally, right? So it's a pretty decent sample group, 650 large companies with an intentional program. And what they found was in the top 10, if you've not seen the report, I'm going to put it in the chat as soon as I'm talking, but what they found is some of the top 10 giving organizations stayed the same. American Civil Liberties Union moved to third place, up from sixth place. Red Cross moved from third place to fourth place. Doctors Without Borders moved from fourth place to fifth place, so on and so forth. Some of those you'd expect to see. The unexpected ones were really interesting. The number one group to receive funding was the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. This is typically the group that's representing the unrepresented or the marginalized. And they moved from number 561 all the way up to number one. That's pretty impressive. Similarly, the Equal Justice Initiative moved from 154 up to number 2. Far more interesting is what happened with the fiscal sponsor for Black Lives Matter Global Network, which Jerome accurately pointed out there's a difference between the mindset of and a movement of Black Lives Do Matter to the organization, But that group moved to number 6, up from number 18,064. So a lot of the things that are out there, I think, to address the issues that created or could directly address the issues of racial inequity and diversity, equity, inclusion, some of these other things were so down at the bottom of the list, and this just catapulted them up. And we, along with that, we know from our own research that a ton of funding flowed away from other organizations into these. It may be a bit of an overcorrection, but maybe it's also necessary to see moments like this where we can begin to step back and go, why was this group way down at number 18,000 in the first place? So it's an interesting trend. So based on the most recent data, it is very much still the front of minds for people in funding.
Thank you. And also researchers found that diversity training can be effective, of course, for equity, but this is depending on many factors, including reminding the message again and again and supporting with employee experience and diversity efforts in a holistic way. So employee volunteering can be an effective tool to bring people together and for a meaningful purpose and transforming the bias. And you are talking and writing about this, Chris, I am following. Would you please explain the neuroscience of bias and the link between inclusion and employee volunteering?
So this is an interesting topic, and I do have a longer explanation for people because I know, Arzu, our time is limited here. So it's a webinar, and there's a bit of an article that I did for somebody else. It's a different platform. It's Engage for Good. But really quickly, all human beings have a bias that we inherited from our ancestors to prefer people who are like us. The more you look like us, talk like us, similar education, socioeconomic background, it is a bias towards people that we can identify with and understand. And that is just normal. And there's a lot of reasons why, you know, if you believe in evolution, if you believe in the science of evolution, if you have another belief, whatever that may be, there's a lot of reasons why humanity has evolved to act this way. The problem is that empathy, which is a key driver reward system for helping other people, only works for people who are a lot like you. And the less like you they are, the more distance there is between you and me, the less empathy I feel, right? And this all comes out of social identity theory, which is a fascinating topic. And again, I break that down a little bit more. But the only way to rewire your brain, the neurons in your brain, to think more inclusively about another person is to have an experience with them. And that's where employee volunteering comes in, because you can go to places in your community, groups in your community. Turkey is a diverse country to a great extent. Then there are opportunities to step out of your group and go work with another group. And if the conditions are right, if I can picture in my mind the other person and what it would be like to be them, which means that we have to tell a strong why story. And secondly, if I can understand the significance of why this task matters, if I'm at a food bank or whatever, those two things can create an experience where my brain will actually, and I've seen videos of it, it's fascinating, regrow its neurons to deal with this new information that's coming in. Now that doesn't always happen. Just going to volunteer doesn't mean that you're going to get a new mindset. But continual experience over a long period of time, or trauma works too. You drop somebody in Kenya, Nairobi, and you drop them in Kibera, the largest slum in the world, or one of the largest slums in the world, 1.2 million people, and you start volunteering there, and you do that for a week, your brain is configured differently, and that will last you the rest of your life. So yeah, that's the connection between employee volunteering, offering those experiences, and then what changes in our brain. And the term is called neuroplasticity.
I hear again. Can you stop the recording now, please?
Yes.
Can you stop the recording?
Again.
No, again?
Do you not want to record at all? We're good. It was just a guest who's now muted themselves.
Oh, okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah.
I want to ask now the question to both of you, Jerome and Chris. Okay, we know that many researchers research show that now employees want that their companies be as a part of the solution, right? They want that they be corporate activists. But on the other hand, the companies start many programs and employee volunteering programs, but they have some difficulties in engaging employees. So do you have some tactics for that? How could they invite employees and engage them and make them activists instead of someone who just sits and waits?
I'll let Chris take this one first.
A hard question?
Sure. I think we have to appeal to where people are. So if most people don't formally volunteer in the world, even in North America, where volunteering may be a more popular social activity, only 1 in 5 adults volunteer in a formal way with a nonprofit kind of thing like that. So for those individuals, they just need a great experience. But to get them to have that great experience, we have to appeal to what's already interesting to them. So we call this a value bundle. So going to work at a food bank isn't going to be interesting to people who don't know anything about food banks, poverty, and don't have any experience with it. But if I'm going to go to the food bank and a friend asks me at work, so that's really important. And Jerome has talked about this in some of his stuff before, I believe. Secondly, you can bring your friends or family, you can bring your kids, whatever happens to be intrinsic motivators. Like, I need to spend more time with my family. I want to show my kids how to act as a giving adult in community. I want to be able to model that. So bringing my kids. So every volunteering opportunity doesn't have to have all these things, but I think it's really important to think through who the target audience is and what will attract them. And it's usually not the volunteering, but all the other things that you can include in the experience. For Microsoft, they make it a lot of fun. We come, we have fun. There's a lot of fun activities and games that you can do, and then everybody goes bowling afterwards and has beer or whatever. That kind of extrinsic motivator is very helpful to get people through the door so they at least have a good experience and just have one thought, hey, this wasn't terrible. I could do this again. Right? That'll be their first experience. And then they're on the way. Now we have to nudge them along after that to keep coming back and go deeper. But I think we have to start where people are at.
Yeah, and to really add on that, I think one of the things that Chris is talking about is aligning the opportunity to volunteer and serve with somebody's value system, right? Mm-hmm. One of the hardest parts of getting corporate employees involved on a larger strategy for the company is that not everybody's going to align with that strategy, right? If your strategy is to support those who live on the spectrum of poverty or food insecurity, or ecosystem restoration, and that's where you're focused as a company using your company's resources, but there's a segment of the population within your employee base that want to do animal welfare, it becomes incredibly difficult to align that energy with where you want it to go. And so you really have to start thinking about people's value systems, the things that they care about as employees. Because as an employee, when I show up at work, I bring my full self. I bring all the things, all of my moral and character values, and those are the things that I want to see my company exude. But I don't separate those things, and so that's what I think about. What are people's values? What are the cause areas that they're emotionally passionate about? And then how do I get them? How do I get that energy? How do I harness it in a way that I can push towards our company's social impact goals? And so as a social impact professional, one of my jobs, of course, is to tap into that energy, to understand our employees' value systems, and then create toolkits and policy and guidelines that empowers them to do it, and then to also equip them to do it very effectively. But it's a pretty big challenge. The other thing that I'll say on this specific topic is, I think, and if I heard you correctly, Arzu, is that we're talking about volunteer engagement. I want to use one word that you mentioned. You had said something to the effect of, how do we get our employees to be more activist? And I will share that here in America, within corporate volunteerism or corporate America, the word activism is actually really stigmatized. Activism, it almost in some instances, especially in corporate America, it sends up red flags of, oh my goodness, we're going to incur risk, right? So many companies, they don't want to make activists out of their employees because to them, they're opening up their company to risk. There are some companies, however, that do push that narrative, if you will. I'm going to use two different companies for example, Patagonia. They give paid time off to employees who want to peacefully march and be activists around environmental protection and ecosystem restoration. They actively really want their employees to embrace the stewardship of our environment. They want that. Companies like Ben and Jerry's, which is a prominent, I believe, Vermont-based ice cream company here in America, they're very, very progressive, very out there in front of these issues, and they are not afraid of that. They're very bold, and I suspect their employees are very bold. But for more traditional conservative companies, they have a very specific strategy. They have very specific guidelines, and for them, the idea of activist is scary. They're often trying to pull their employees together to push them down a pipeline that fits within their company's focus as a social impact team, if that makes sense.
And how could they then differentiate themselves if they use the old messages? If they don't give any feeling, if they don't even really support a cause, I mean, with these traditional ways? I mean, for instance, even in Turkey, I know how Ben and Jerry's, I watch their videos, they even support death penalty. I mean, this is an ice cream brand, right? But they speak about death penalty because it is important. So, but this connects me because then I see that they are really sincere there. Mm-hmm. But if they don't do anything, if they don't talk about anything, but just for instance, just give some donations and just paint some schools, then you don't create a brand or you don't create a reputation, and even you don't get the best employees, right? Because they now expect.
Yeah, and I think many companies, they're walking a real tightrope, because one of the things that I think I shared earlier is they have to react to investors and stakeholders. They have to react to their executive, their C-suite executives. They also have to represent their employees. They also have to represent their customers, and they also they have to represent their, in some instances, if they're lobbying, right, they have to represent their political their political base as well. And so they're oftentimes walking a tightrope. And I think that that's incredibly difficult for brands to get correctly. And honestly, there's nobody who's like really doing it perfect. You might be listening to your customers, and you might say and do the things that your customers want you to do. But if your investors are incredibly wary or a little bit more conservative about your taking that action, then you're definitely gonna feel that from your stakeholders and investors during your investor relations call that you might do quarterly. So it's a tightrope, and I think it's an incredibly difficult one to walk, especially when you're trying to keep so many people happy. And so you end up doing the best that you can. And again, I think that there's a spectrum. There are companies who are not doing a good job at it at all. And I think we see those companies sometimes in news headlines. I'm not going to name any, but we see them because they're in the news. And then there are companies who are doing this very, very well because their core values, the things that they care about as a company, are immediately transferable and digestible and adopted by their customers and their employees and their stakeholders. And I think, for example, Ben & Jerry's is one of those, right? Ben & Jerry's is, they attract a very specific type of talent. They attract a very they're a very specific type of customer, and they're okay with that. They're okay with attracting those that align with their core values. And if that means that they're going to lose a few pennies over it, like they're okay with that because they're living their core values.
Thank you. You also answered now my last question too, because I am going to ask you, how could companies and brands be more sincere and impactful if they really want to support a cause? But you talked about values. And is there anything that you want to add to answer this question?
Yeah, and I'm actually going to put something in a chat box here because I actually wrote a post about this. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. People can go through and they can actually just read it. But there are 6 points that I try to make. The first is that I think any company, they have to go beyond that public statement. It's not enough that you have a press release or that you proclaim something on social media. The second step, getting beyond that goal or that very specific public statement, is that you also have to create goals and be transparent and publicly communicate these goals. But they have to also be outcomes focused goals. They cannot be output. It can't be, well, it's just, we're going to accumulate or we're going to achieve a certain number of hours of volunteer service and we're going to donate this amount of money. Output specific goals, numeric goals, don't indicate effectiveness towards achieving a positive outcome. So the second step is create outcomes focused goals. The third is you have to have executive commitment, right? Your C-suite, they have to be fully on board. They have to give you that blessing. And they're going to hold themselves and the rest of the company accountable. The fourth goal, the fourth action, is to develop a very consistent cross-functional collaboration committee or group. It's important to have everybody rowing in the same direction at the same cadence, like a crew team. So you have to have regular, you can't have DEI in its own little corner, siloed from every other functional team within a company. They have to be connected. And these types of DEI tasks, they have to be done holistically throughout the entire company. The fifth is to be more active in the community. And I think one of the things that Chris really focuses on, and we talked about this when we're talking about removing bias from people through very purposeful and intentional volunteer engagement. You can do that, but it takes a lot of hard work. The way that you show up in a community and volunteer or grant give, what you don't want to do is you don't want to perpetuate a savior mentality, and you don't want to perpetuate power dynamics that are negative. So showing up in the community, being active, and doing that purposefully is important. And then I'm going to share a sixth, and then also one that I didn't include in this article that I probably should have. Number 6 is to develop programming internally where employees can actively work on their own bias as individuals. If I'm an incredibly biased person, that's going to show up in all the work that I do. So I have to constantly work on myself as an individual as well. And that's incredibly important for companies to create that space for employees to do that individually. The last thing that I'll share, and I didn't add this in the article, is be very, apply your diversity, equity, and inclusion lens on how you give money. Perhaps that might be focusing money on Black-led or minority-led organizations, or perhaps it's supporting your community-based partner in creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment within their own organization, or applying money to organizations who were also having their own self-reckoning to do better for the communities that we're all advocating for. So that's number 7. And again, you can read all the tidbits in the article that I put in the chat box.
Thank you. I will also share the link with everyone. And Chris, is there anything you want to add to this question?
I just want to underscore maybe where Jerome landed. And I think that is, if a company wants to be seen as supporting and standing up for a cause or a community, they not only have to do something to interact with that cause or community, maybe it's a grant, maybe it's a connection or partnership, then they have to turn around and look at that issue or that community representation in the company. Mm-hmm. And those two things move you from the first stage, which is that's an issue. We should do something. The first response maybe is a financial gift. Fine. But the leader then has to say, is that issue our issue? Are we dealing with it as well? And that moves you from being a performative ally or virtue signaling to something more substantive and being a part of it. And Jerome and I both know a number of companies that make a big fuss about doing things and being seen as leaders internationally. But we both know inside, there's very little to no interest in doing the hard work. But that's true for all of us. We can make a donation online and say, hey, I support Black Lives Matter. And we can stay right where we are with our own hidden biases and racist attitudes because it's horrible work. It's just awful, hard, messy, complicated work. And if there's one thing that companies want to avoid at all costs, it's risk and problems. And so, but that's the only way forward, I think, as a nation and as a private enterprise.
Thank you. And we are all biased. I mean, this is
right. Yeah.
You know this, but also artificial intelligence is biased too, because the algorithms are designed by people who have bias. So I watched on Netflix Coded Bias. So it shows exactly how it works. And now, how do you see the future? I mean, will we live in a racist world with racist AI robots, or do we understand that we are all human and actually we are all on the same boat? Both of you, please.
Yeah, Jerome, why don't you kick that off?
Yeah, sure. And I'm going to be, I think, a little shorter on this. I'm not going to pretend like I understand technology and artificial intelligence, but I think that there is a theme here. And it gets back to one of the things that I think Chris and I already talked about, and it's internally doing the hard work on ourselves. Because the employees, the people who are actually doing the work, right, creating the goods and services, or in this case, creating the technology, if they have their own bias, that bias is likely going to show up in the actual technology that they create. I'm going to use one example. So here in America, politically, we're incredibly polarized. So one of the arguments that I see quite often within news headlines here is, are algorithms that we use through social media, are they unintentionally censoring certain groups because of the bias from the people who work in big tech, who are creating the algorithms for social media platforms? And this is the example. Conservatives and liberals. So in America, Democrats and Republicans, they squabble all the time. But the conservative Republican argument is that their content is being censored, inadvertently censored, because the people who are making the codes and the algorithms at big companies, like all the big tech companies that have these social media platforms, are creating algorithms, and those employees are oftentimes left-leaning in how they're in their politics. And so the big argument from conservatives is that the algorithms that are funneling and catching and feeding their social feeds are biased, because essentially there is a different political makeup from those who are creating those algorithms at those companies. That can be debated all day, I'm sure, but the point that I'm trying to make is the products, the goods and services, the way that we carry out our day-to-day jobs and the work that we do is absolutely influenced by my blind spots and my bias unintentionally. And so we have to be very mindful of that, especially as we start getting into technology and artificial intelligence and things that are going to essentially automate our world.
Yeah. Now, I would add to that it's just a natural extension of how our bias works into our education system, our textbooks, access to goods and services in the community, the whole thing. And so, of course, artificial intelligence is going to reflect some of that bias. I highly recommend the Netflix show Coded Bias that Arzu mentioned. I put it in the chat. It's just called Coded Bias. And it's a documentary that investigates the bias in algorithms. And it was after an MIT Media Lab researcher uncovered flaws. She's a Black woman in facial recognition programs. So it's phenomenal, and then they build from there. You might have to take it in bite sizes because it's so disappointing. Because it's the one place where you thought, well, a machine isn't going to be biased, right? But human beings, it's just so prevalent everywhere. And so I do think it's a great example, Arzu, of how when some people say, look, I don't believe in systemic racism. I don't believe the education system is biased towards, in North America anyways, middle-class white men who are, by the way, evangelical or Christian, even middle-class white men. I don't believe that. Because then you could just say, well, it's showing up in artificial intelligence. How could it not show up in all these other places as well?
Okay, thank you. Now our time is about to end. And I hope we won't have a racist AI in the future and not racist people in the future. And this could only happen if we understand how biased we are and challenge ourselves and start to talk to each other and see that we are all human, wherever we are, how we look, what gender we are. We are all unique and all great, and we share one world together. So thank you for your inspiring speeches today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, it was great. It was good to be here.
Thank you. Chris, can you stop the recording?
I will.
Thank you. Hey.